Hello and welcome to EGM722, Week 2, Part 1, Using Other People's Code. In the lecture this week, we will start off by talking about how we can use different external modules in order to write our own code. We'll also talk about using help and documentation for different functions and external modules that we might be using, followed by a discussion on errors and debugging, and we'll finish up by talking about classes and objects in Python. So in addition to the built-in functions, Python ships with something called a standard library, which you can find at this link here. You can also follow the link that I have posted on the reading materials section of the Blackboard page. So this standard library includes different tools for using math-related functions, random numbers, multiprocessing, so how we can use multiple processors to help parallelize or speed up our code, as well as different modules for working with the operating system of the computer. Lots of different things there, so I heavily recommend you go check that out at this link. But these are not automatically available to us when we open up the Python interpreter or when we're writing a Python script. We actually have to tell Python to use them in order to be able to use them. So we can use these external modules using something called an import statement. So Python actually gives us the ability to import and use external modules, either the ones from the standard library or ones that we write ourselves or ones that are maintained by a third party. So a module is a file that contains a collection of functions and classes which we can then use when we're writing our own programs. So some examples shown here, the math, which is part of the Python standard library, as well as random. We saw GeoPandas in the practical from last week, as well as a module called ArcPy, which you can use to interface with all of the different functions found in ArcGIS. In order to work with these modules, we need to use something called an import statement. So you saw this again in the practical last week. This just says to import whatever the name of the module is, and once we have done that, we can then use all of the different functions and classes that are contained in that particular module. So here we're using the random module, and you can see here we can use a function called random to print a random number between 0 and 1, or a function called random integer, or randint, which returns a random integer between the two numbers that you pass to it. So in scripts, when we're importing modules, it's recommended to only use a single module at a time, so using it like this, so import random. If we want to then also import math, that would be another line in the script, and so on down. So we try to make sure that we are only importing a single module at a time, because that helps to make the code a bit more readable when we're going back through it. Another thing that we can use to help us make our code a bit more readable is something called aliasing. So sometimes module names, especially when we're starting to use submodules and even sub-submodules of different things, we end up with very long strings. So we can shorten these using something called an alias. And the way that this works is that we say to import whatever the module or submodule is that we're trying to work with, and then we rename it as something else. So a very common one that you'll see is with the matplotlib.pyplot. You import that as plt, and that means that instead of having to type out matplotlib.pyplot.plot and whatever else you need to do, you have just 3 letters that you're using here. Another very common one is to import numpy as np. As you can see here in the example from the interpreter that I have on this side of the slide, and you can see that this makes it a little bit easier to see what we're doing rather than having lots of long names to work with. Once we import modules in this way, we have to use the alias name. So the interpreter has no idea what matplotlib.pyplot is because we have renamed it. So we need to make sure that we keep track of whatever we have imported different modules as. And when we do that, we can, for example, use a line like this. So plot.plt.plot, and then some variable x, and then the sign of x, and we get a nice graph like this. Sometimes we might want to import only a single function or only a single submodule from a particular module or particular package. And if we want to do that, then we can use something called from. So here, for example, if we only wanted to use the randint function from the random module, then we would say from random import randint. We can separate different imports using commas. So this is actually something that is recommended to do rather than having a from random import randint and then from random import random and so on. We can say from random import and then the two functions or two submodules that we want to work with. We can also use something called a star import, which will import everything that is contained within that particular module, but this is very much not recommended. For one thing, you don't necessarily know all of the different functions that are defined in a particular module. It also means that anything that that module imports in the process of writing the different functions contained within that module are also going to be imported. That can end up overwriting the things that you have tried to import, so it can become a very big mess that gets very difficult to sort out. So it's heavily recommended to avoid using these star imports. So to sum all of this up, Python comes with a number of different standard modules that we can use that have a variety of different functions. If we want to use these or any modules and packages beyond the built-in functions, we have to first import them. Import statements tell the interpreter what modules or what module or functions to import and what to call them. And finally, make sure that you avoid using star imports, as it makes it very difficult to keep track of variable and function names, and it can be a giant headache that you really just want to avoid. So I hope that was useful and interesting for you, and if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to post them in the discussion forum on Blackboard. Thanks. Bye.